and thanks for being here. It's very, very nice to have this opportunity. Actually, this series is proving to be quite interesting, and it's also a good way to stay in touch with former alumni that we would not have a chance otherwise to see. So it looks like a good format, and hopefully in the future could supplement, maybe not, of course it's not a good substitution for an in-person seminar, but it's something that is actually has its own science. So we are here today to talk in a very, very half-baked way about a project that I'm doing with Federico Soldani, who is a psychologist, a medical doctor. He holds a medical doctorate from the University of Pisa, then a Master of Science from Harvard University, and he's been for a long time at the Center of Disease Control in the United States, in Washington, and now is working for the mental health services in London. He's a psychologic virologist, a psychiatric virologist, which is a very interesting concept, because we think we are used to see virologists in the television every evening at these times of our life, as very severe guys that deal with not touching each other and maintaining and putting on masks and stuff like that. And so I wonder how come that someone is both a psychiatrist and a virologist, and it turned out that there is an explanation, and which is not a special path that he has followed, but it's like basic in the discipline to consider virology also in the domain of psychiatry. But I think that Federico will tell us something more, a little less confused about that in presenting himself when he'll start talking. We've been working together now for a few months. It was one of those very casual encounters. Actually, we've never seen each other physically. Federico wrote me a note sending me some of his work some time ago, and I read his work, and I found it extremely interesting, because he was working on politicization of psychiatry and the political psychiatry. That is to say, the deployment of psychiatry for political purposes and the political origins of psychiatry. And he was dealing with a very interesting idea that kind of stimulated me from the beginning, that was the mentalization of the political leadership. You know, people saying Trump is crazy, and not just saying Trump is crazy, but also those that vote for Trump are crazy. And or using, you know, ideas such as homophobia or xenophobia. So these are all terms that refer to disturbed mental capacities that are attributed to those whose political visions are different or extremely different from your own. And so there is some sort of this interesting process of putting mental labels to political opinion that I thought it was quite interesting, an observation. And so we started discussing a little bit of such ideas, and we ended up finding some quite interesting common ground, because I've been interested for a long time in and you guys that know me at the IUC for sure know that, and also because it's one of the reasons why I participated in the foundation of the IUC, is I've been fascinated by the process of depolitization of something that is so intimately political as the law. The law is perhaps the most political tool that humans have in their hands. However, they've been using and deploying for a long period of time a rhetoric that has been made it non-political, so that lawyers can appear and speak about some sort of objective positiveness of a legal system that has formalized every connection with the political process and has been living a life that is separated, its own autopoietic way of working which is, of course, I claim, and many with me, of course, very, very political, in the sense that there is very little that is as political and something that says not to be political. And this is very much true for psychiatry as well. We've seen the idea that only others use psychiatry for political purposes, as much as we say that only others use law for political purposes. Those that use law for political purposes lack the rule of law. We've been saying that of socialist legality. We're saying that about Chinese, about China. We've been saying that about Africa. You know, the idea that if you don't know, if you don't have some pure theory of law, then you lack the law. The idea that there is something else out there to decide processes, social processes in a differently legitimized way doesn't even occur to the Orientalist mind. And similarly, you know, some of these observations happen also with psychiatry. For example, we've been trained to think that one of the ways that communists were dealing with political opponents was to send them to mental facilities. And that was one way in which the Soviet legal system would handle opposition. And we are very quick in seeing that when it's done by someone who was at the other side of the capitalist bloc, but we find it very much more difficult to see that when it happens in our own conditions. And this is true in a variety of ways. But I want first to show you the big picture we're trying to and give you the blunt thesis of the talk that then is going to be the book whose proposal you had. The thesis is that there has been a process of retraction of law from the political space. The law has been conquering a large role in organizing politically society and in organizing it under some rational ideas. The very meaning of use of law in the Latin tradition means principled, means connected to justice, and the idea of right, the very idea of right, you know, human rights, is the idea of straight, is the idea of something that is straight, that as opposed to twisted, as opposed to wrong, is a notion of some sort of well-organized principle artifact of society that is governed under these principles, and these principles are, in a way, their own, legitimized by their own logic, okay? So this has produced legal modernity. This very vision evolves over a long period of time, arrived at the beginning of the 17th century into the very making of the sovereign state, into the very idea of law that emerged out of the Peace of Westphalia, the building of the sovereign state, into the very idea of law as introduced in major codifications in Europe and elsewhere after the French Revolution, the Bourgeois Revolution, and in the very idea of law of the common law tradition. In other words, legal rationalism, the vision of law as a rational set of rules that are grounded into some rationality principle within the human intellect, has been behind the whole process of modernity, with the major and very, very large role that law has played in that process. The claim here is that there has been, just in the last 10 years, a very, very dramatic change in technology that is now making the law useless for the very purpose that determined its success. Okay, the success of law in the Western legal tradition, in the very time in which it had enjoyed its success, was to create a predictable framework for capitalist reproduction. Okay, the idea of the law, and this is something that is not new in our analysis. This is an analysis that was best of everybody introduced by Pashukanis in the Soviet legal tradition, but it's also an analysis that resounds what law and economics people say even today, this notion that the law is a set of rules, of rational rules, of property rights, sometimes we say, that allow to have predictability, certainty, and out of this predictability and this certainty, contracts can be enforced, investment can be guaranteed, and capitalism finds its framework in order to reproduce itself, okay? So this is the function that law has been playing throughout modernity. In previous work of mine and with Alessandra, with Capra, and with others, or with Laura Nader, I've been trying to introduce some sort of a critique, a contextual critique of all of that, and also to explore the consequences. The consequences being basically the transformation, the progressive transformation of commons into capital. Okay, the construction of this framework of predictability of society allows use values to get morphed into exchange value, commons consequently becoming capital, capital accumulation working through the infrastructures of private law. This would be what we have until now. What we claim in this book is that actually beginning from the mid of the last decade, so we are talking about an extremely recent period of time, with the diffusion of internet communication technology under the label of smart technology, that is to say, second and third generation internet technology, the one that we carry with us constantly. We now have a different way of capitalist reproduction that made the law entirely obsolete and made it basically useless for the place in which there is the most important space for capitalist reproduction and accumulation today, which is the internet sphere. Okay, so since 2007 is the age of birth of the Apple iPhone, so the first small computers, carryable computers and cell phones. From that time onwards, we've seen an amazing process of universalization of knowledge. Some 4 billion people are connected to the net for some 8 hours a day, which is longer than the amount of time we spend in sleeping, for example. This ratio of time is constantly growing. This structure and this technology very quickly made people highly addicted to it. In other words, we basically cannot think of living or surviving without being connected to some screen for a very long number of hours a day. This connection to the screen for a very long number of hours a day has produced the internet frontier, what we call the smart frontier. The smart frontier is a place in which transactions occur in a non-tangible way, but it is the place in which capitalism has been moving. Pretty much like the way in which capitalism moved from the center to the periphery in the time of discovery, you know, from the Americas to the North America in the 17th century, all the way through colonialism and expansion. The frontier has been a place of capitalist expansion, and the mother country suddenly became addicted to the frontier. Okay, there is this phenomenon of expansion, experimentation, and addiction to those experimentations. I'm very, very happy that Mariella Pandolfi is here with us, because she just sent me a paper that I was reading that actually tries a similar hypothesis, if I understood it properly, with the camps. You know, the refugee camps being some sort of a place in which capitalism experiments structures of social organization that then return to the mother country and actually work and are experimented there and return here. Okay, we make this big claim with the law. We say, okay, the capitalist goes on the frontier on the internet and then returns. It has always happened. You know, the law, European law went to the Americas, and in the American, it experimented all the institutions of modernity. It's not a chance that the US Constitution is the first constitution of the world. It's not a chance that in the United States, the first idea of full private property as sovereignty were applied. It's not a surprise that in America, the full concentration of power into the executive and the system of checks and balances, the ideas of Montesquieu were experimented over there earlier than everywhere else, okay? Why? Because there are not those kind of accumulation of knowledge that make experimentation impossible in the mother country. Okay, you need to construct something new. This is the very old idea of Locke. You know, you need to have a tabula rasa, and then on the tabula rasa you construct something new that then you re-import in the mother country. Okay, so today the thing is happening very, very quickly with the internet frontier. In the internet frontier, we experimented something unique from the point of view of the legal system, which is this complete substitution of the logic of take it or leave it from the logic of contract, okay? In these 10 years in which we've been surfing the net, in which we've been around, you know, buying stuff, getting involved with, you know, insurance companies and all of that, we got used mentally to the fact that we can either take it or leave it. There is no space for negotiation. There is no space for nuances. You want to use Facebook in order to communicate, you agree with Facebook, but you know, either you agree or you leave it. You are free not to use Facebook. Too bad that if you don't use Facebook, then you are, you know, singled out from, marginated from, for example, political campaigns, okay? So the logic of take it or leave it is the logic of the internet frontier. And it's a logic in which there is no space for the law. It is by definition a place in which the law only works as a system that is basically a disturbance to the way in which capital reproduces, okay? In the very Taylorist organization of Google Corporation, for example, which is a typical example of Taylorism applied to intellectual knowledge, the very idea that there might be privacy rights or there might be intellectual property, there might be anything in between the mere act of extraction and of subsumption and of measurement of the life is actually just a disturbance. It's not something that serves any other purpose than making business more difficult, okay? Which is exactly the opposite function of the law that capitalism is facing. The law has been traditionally helping capitalism to reproduce. No law, no capitalist reproduction. No institutions like, you know, the corporation or contract or property or torts, the institutions of private law, then you could not have the amount of predictability that was needed in order to invest and to obtain returns. Today, the law changed the function and the relationship with capitalism. Law is just a disturbance to capitalist reproduction. If it is a disturbance to capitalist reproduction, the values that the law was throwing in the capitalist process, so that the law, what was doing it, was necessary in order for capitalists to reproduce, but because it was in some sense necessary, we could have as lawyers the luxury of preaching some values, okay? We were needed for the main purpose, the main goal of capitalism. We were helping out on that, and then they would stay with us and stick with us when we would preach things like, you know, equality or things like that. Today, the values of the legal system are devoid from any capacity to determine, to control, and to tame the brutal extraction based on the de facto relationship of the take it or leave it, okay? So the law is fading away, is going away, and is leaving a huge space open there for grab. Okay, who is taking this huge space? And this is the article, the aim of our book, is to show how psychiatry that has basically filled up the vacuum that the law has left open in the organizational society. And this has been happening in the very, very, very visibly In this, of course, it is a process that in the book we kind of follow through its own its own conditions and where it was experimented and the amount of ideology produced and the experiments elsewhere. But this notion of psychiatry entering into the sphere and challenging for the first time the idea of the legal person. Those of you who are students at the IUC, I think I gave you a lecture on the legal personality at the beginning of the semester. The legal person as the mask, you know, as something that is the meaning and the relevance of the person in flesh and blood. Our emotions, our body, our look, all of that is actually completely irrelevant for the law. The law just deals with persons. That is an objectified external image that is necessary in order to make society organized, okay? So the law never tried really to go behind the person. The law works a very objectifying function and is really pretty much content with the ways in which the person behaves in the external space. Okay? Today, the entrance of psychiatry within the picture is actually challenging the mask, is actually getting behind the mask to go to try not only to control the emotions, but also to determine the emotions through the constant process of maintaining people addicted to the spectacle, to the tremendous investment in marketing propaganda, in psychiatric sciences, in cognitive sciences, and so on and so forth. On this sort of idea that humans are flawed, that our understanding is an understanding that doesn't really function in real complex conditions. We are full of biases, where the machine, based on the collection of tremendous amount of materials from the organized society, the machine actually better knows than us how society should be organized and what is good for us. Okay, the machine arrives to predict our judgments in our own interest, and we are so forth constructing and going very close to a system of social control, a controlling process that has very little to do with the external behavior of individuals and has to do rather on the attempt to determine what actually happens. Okay, so the law goes away, psychiatrists come in. And this works, of course, is a complicated process. We have lots of clues from a variety of aspects, and now Federico will tell you something about his own vision of the thing. But this kind of model, and I finish on this, is actually determined and is determining a quite major process of transformation also in the global hegemony. And in this last current phase, the phase of the pandemic, we've seen all these processes precipitating very much. The logic of the internet frontier is now precipitating back in our social organization. Practically everything is now moved, including what we're doing now. Practically everything is now moving on the network. The network is becoming the most pervasive and important physical space in which we can perform human relationships. And the network, of course, is not something that exists out there, but is something that is a human construction having its own political meaning and having its own very important and deep political conditioning. Okay? The internet is not the place of freedom that comes down of the clouds. It has a lot of infrastructural issues that are going on. There are lots of international political conditions happening. But what we are pointing out here, and this is the last point I want to put up on the ground of the discussion, is that after the crisis, the Chinese model, that for many, many years has been, in some sense, pointed out and singled out as a place of no law and condemned for that. And actually a place that was busy trying to import legal structures from the West. So the exchange in the domain of institutions was from the West to China, has now quickly changed direction. We are now seeing a very important role of Chinese solutions, including the construction of massive amounts of prediction technology into the system, including the sort of relationship between a sort of the stage that that is left open for a political process that happens outside of warring with the law within political structures and political ideas or ideas of hierarchy. In other words, when the persons leave the stage, okay, when there is this final depolitization of the citizen that first becomes the consumer, then becomes himself the commodity, and now becomes even the patient is not someone that can show any agency in the overall organization of society. So the patient has, in a way, no role in determining the overall decision making. The overall decision making is determined by the political process, which is more and more technologized and more in the hands of non-political entities or political entities with very different attitudes, at least in the West, than the one we were dealing with before. Okay, I'm gonna stop here and leave the ground to Federico. Thank you very much. Federico.
Okay, thank you very much, Hugo, for your amazing introduction. Of course, I would just specify I'm a doctor. I'm a psychiatric epidemiologist, and I work as an epidemiologist at the Food and Drug Administration, not at the CDC when I was when I was in Washington DC. I mean, essentially, what a psychiatric, what an epidemiologist is someone who studies the distribution of not only of diseases, but of so-called health states, and then tries to figure out what could be the causes at the population level for such distributions. So essentially, an epidemiologist studies, the causes of health-related states at the population level, just to give you this sort of overall idea. Now, let me specify, my presentation, my discussion is going to be, a little bit patchy. This is a complex kind of, dialectic interaction between the law, and I don't know much about law because I didn't study, jurisprudence, and these other fields that, in a sense, are, medical. The field of medicine, the field of psychiatry, and the field of public health, including epidemiology. So please, if anybody has a question during these more or less, half an hour that I'm thinking of talking, please feel free to step in and to ask for any kind of clarification, either about terminology or about anything that I've said. So we are trying to work with Hugo on this idea that whether we like it or not, and we think that some of these changes might have to be resisted, but whether we like it or not, the overall trend that we are observing, and that other people are observing as well, is from the law, so from this idea of the mask, as Hugo said, to what is behind the mask. And essentially, why is this digital revolution related with psychiatry? Well, to put it simply, it's because this digital technology is quite pervasive and quite invasive, okay? So it goes, in a sense, beyond the mask, because it's recording our behaviors, our preferences, even increasingly our sort of emotions and emotional sort of reactions. Even just during the past few days, I believe on Facebook, for those who are on Facebook, they have added a new reaction, which is hugging. So now we can virtually hug each other. So, so in this sense, the digital, revolution, and what goes with the digital revolution, which is, the automation revolution and the Internet of Things as well, more and more so. And now we have seen even drones, etc., and this type of devices. So what is behind the mask, which is what in the past, or what some people from a religious point of view would refer to today, it implies that our soul or our psyche or our mind or our personality is increasingly more and more scrutinized, and our characteristics are sort of in the public domain to some extent. So so this is more or less how I would put how I would present this relationship between the digital revolution and the importance of cognitive sciences, of psychiatry, etc. Because by being invasive and pervasive, what is behind the mask, which is what is on our minds, becomes more and more important. So just one word, what is psychiatry? Essentially, it's a word that was invented by a doctor in 1808, so a little bit more than 200 years ago, a German doctor, Christian Reil, and the etymology is from psyche and iatros. Psyche is for mind or psyche or soul, and iatros is for doctor. So every time that we talk about psychiatry, we are referring to medicine. Yeah. When we talk about psychology, we might refer to industrial psychology, for instance, which is very important actually for the development during the 20th century of what we call community psychiatry, which is psychiatry that was not limited anymore to the asylums or the madhouses, but entered the larger community. So this is mainly, so when we talk about psychiatry, we are referring to medicine. Okay, so this is really important to sort of understand. While psychology can refer to industrial psychology. Okay, and then just another couple of terms, if that's okay. Well, actually, let me clarify this. How is psychiatry related to politics in any way? Because I think this is, a question many people might have. It's not an obvious one, because people might say, well, the very same way that we have a doctor for the heart, or we have a doctor for our stomach or for our liver, then there is a doctor for the brain. Okay, that's perfectly reasonable. And actually, we have neurology. Okay, so but then about 250 years ago, more or less, this figure of the psychiatrist just emerged in the context, historically, of the revolutions, of the American Revolution. And the founder of the American psychiatry, Benjamin Rush, was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Anybody who takes what is considered to be the Bible of psychiatry, with the full list of mental and behavioral disorders that is produced by the American Psychiatric Association, will observe, there is an icon with Benjamin Rush on it, which was, until a few years ago, the symbol of the American Psychiatric Association. And then we have another figure that is Philippe Pinel in revolutionary France, or in post-revolutionary France, immediately after the revolution. He is considered to be the father of psychiatry. So, the father of the medical approach to behavioral and mental conditions. So, this is just to clarify. So, psychiatry starts out in the context of political revolutions. So this is not just a coincidence. Let me quote just a single sentence from the very first memoir of Philippe Pinel. So this doctor who is considered to be this sort of father figure for the field of mental medicine, which we call psychiatry. So he said in his very first memoir that he presented to a revolutionary audience. He said that one cannot ignore a striking analogy in nature's ways when one compares the attacks of intermittent insanity with the violent symptoms of an acute illness. So essentially, he had no scientific way to claim that behavioral or mental problems were medical problems. He didn't have a test. He didn't have even, a test post-mortem. But he noted, and other people noted, this sort of analogy. So essentially they said, well, why don't we start considering any sort of behavioral deviance as a medical problem? So, and this has very, very interesting political consequences. Now, these consequences might not be very clear or very visible in normal times when only very few people every now and then might need, for instance, to be committed to a mental health hospital, against their will. Now, this is becoming increasingly clear, the political dimension of psychiatry at the present moment, because this model is being, extended essentially to the entire population. Just yesterday, there was a video circulating. I believe it was from Agrigento, which is a town in Sicily, and there was this man who was talking very loudly in public, and he was expressing his idea that the lockdown was not justified and that people needed to react. We might agree or not, that is not the point. He might actually even, he might have been done something that was illegal as well. So, but it's really interesting that, the police was there, and then even health personnel was called in. And essentially his case, he was sedated apparently, and then he was committed to a mental health hospital, was not treated as a violation of the law, but as a medical problem. So it's a little bit of a subtle kind of thing, because, well, when do we believe that a behavior is caused by a medical problem or by something that is not a medical problem? And let me give you an example of a behavior or of a state of mind that is clearly medical. When I was in medical school, one of our psychiatry professors presented a case. That was a case of a woman who, while she was walking in her home, she stepped into a room and she saw a lion. And she was extremely scared, and then she called for help. And then they made some tests, and they figured out that this woman, she had a brain tumor that was compressing her occipital lobes. So this would have explained this sort of visual kind of hallucination. So most definitely there are physical or organic problems that can cause sort of altered mental states or behaviors that are not considered to be functional or not considered to be within the norm. However, it's a subtle kind of shift when we start to consider any state, any mental state that is not within the norm or that we consider to be not desirable as possibly caused by, a medical cause, especially when we don't have any test to figure out whether it might be a medical cause. And this is true for a very large number of the most common sort of psychiatric conditions. So as you can see, there are cases that are clearly medical, but then there is a very large area, sort of gray area. And nowadays, this gray area is getting bigger and bigger, and it's being extended to the entire population, essentially, where it's debatable, and it's a matter of impression, and it's a matter of sort of analogies, whether someone is misbehaving, according to societal norms, because of a medical cause.
Yeah, this
So,
became,
and
sorry, this became very common, for example, in the last 10, 15 years in the United States, with people complaining in a very sort of lively way for some sort of injustices that, say, a bank or a large institution or a grocery store or something was doing that. So the customer complaining loudly and losing a little bit the temper would be considered crazy, would not be considered a critique to the institution or any kind, but would be considered crazy and taken away. So this is a very easy way to, in a way, discipline the behavior within certain kind of lines. And Federico brought the example in Agrigento. There was last 2-3 weeks ago, there was a case that was quite clamorous in Germany of a woman lawyer, very activist woman lawyer of defending patients' rights and stuff like that, that was committed to the hospital and hospitalized for what in mental care and kept there 3 days for the fact that she started saying and posting that the COVID-19 rules were actually violations of fundamental human rights. So it was a legal position, a political protest of a quite visible figure that was just treated as if she was crazy. Okay, so there is this sort of very subtle way to delegitimize political protest into a mental problem, and once you delegitimize it from political protest to mental problem, it's then much easier to deal with it and much less easy to find people that are willing to actually create alliances with the person who is being singled out as crazy. Sorry.
okay, no, thank you, Hugo. That's another very important example to mention. The one of the German lawyer who was fighting for constitutional rights, and then she was hospitalized against their will. And then, of course, we don't know many of the details of these cases, but we can observe this sort of trend. And also, let me give you another very simple kind of example to understand why psychiatry is somehow, between the sort of legal model and the medical model. And it's essentially creating a sort of shortcut, sort of legal shortcut, or a sort of state of exception, or if you will, a sort of revolution at an individual level, because the person to whom psychiatry is applied, especially in the cases when this is against the will of the person, either because the person is being diagnosed with a condition or with a label that is non-desirable, or in the most extreme cases, when a person is committed to hospital or is treated, against his or her will. So let me give you this example. If you go to a doctor and your blood pressure is measured, and then your doctor might tell you, well, look, it looks like you might have hypertension, and nobody would say, how dare you to accuse me of being hypertensive. I said, well, look, I'm not accusing you of anything, I'm just measuring it. You might like it or not. If you want, you can go to another doctor and get a second opinion. However, when you diagnose with a label that has a lot of social consequences, and to some extent even political consequences, think about the fact if you would like to have a president who has been diagnosed previously with schizophrenia, for instance. So if you go to your doctor, this doctor doesn't even make a test, because there is not a test, but essentially is going to tell you, look, based on my observations, I believe that you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, that you are schizophrenic. And at that point, you might have a slightly different reaction compared to being told that you have hypertension. So this is where psychiatry is treating essentially with a medical model, behaviors and states of mind that have a lot of social and at times even political implications. And this is getting clearer and clearer as this sort of mentality is being applied to the whole population. Okay, so I hope this example was helpful. Also, another kind of operation that all of these psychiatric talk is doing, sometimes without the citizens realizing it. For instance, when we talk about, I don't know, Trump in any psychiatric terms, or any other politician, or even those who are electing Trump, saying, oh, those people are crazy. And sometimes we use the word crazy in a metaphorical way, just to say, well, look, it is as if they are crazy, because this kind of decision that they took, or this vote that they casted, was completely irrational. Okay, but what we are doing by focusing continuously on the mind, or on the brain, or on the behavior of these sort of political actors is essentially to focus continuously not on the environment, or on society, or on the political stage, but essentially on the single individual, or on a subpart of the individual, or sometimes even say on a subpart of the brain, or on a specific function. And then we have seen during these months all of these experts discussing, I mean, a lot of potential diagnoses for Trump. For instance, I can give you some examples. He has been diagnosed, in a sense, from a distance, with being a narcissist, or a pathological narcissist, or a sociopath, or obsessive, compulsive, paranoid, or a conspiracy theorist, which is another interesting label, because it's a sort of anti-political label, because just like talking about cognitive biases, these are sort of anti-political terms, because in a sense they are, I mean, transforming political opinions, even completely regrettable at times political opinions, in sort of medical or pseudo-medical labels. And then he was considered to be, I mean, autistic, and to have out of control anger, and then et cetera, et cetera. So, and I would like to quote, if that's okay, an Italian psychiatrist on this, I mean, Jervis, who in the 70s, when talking about the generals of the Vietnam War, some, I mean, psychiatrists, actually, this guy called Lang, he was considered to be a sort of anti-psychiatrist, but he was a medical doctor, he was practicing as a psychiatrist, and essentially he said that the warmongering American generals could have been considered more dangerously mad than an individual admitted to a madhouse with a diagnosis of psychosis. And some people could say, well, I do agree with that, because I'm totally against what they are doing with the war. But what Jervis observed is quite subtle, but it's very substantial, is that to attribute the behavior of the generals or of the imperialists to a sort of monstrous irrationality, commonly accepted as normal, means not allowing oneself to consider that the logic of war, or of the bomb, or of anger is not the result of a particular psychological process, or of particular psychological processes, but of a social system which is neither mad nor irrational, and simply defends with maximum coherence some vested interests. So essentially, Jervis was telling us we need to go back and to talk about interests and power relations and politics and society, instead of focusing on.
We lost him?
Yes, we lost him.
Okay, so let me keep it from here when he tries to come back, and then I'll add a couple of questions. The conspiracy theory idea we explore in the book is quite interesting, because it's part of a sustained process to persuade the mask to leave the stage. Okay, so the metaphor is the stage is the political arena, the mask is the citizen. Okay, the person which is politically active. And the politically active citizen is some guy that tries to change the stage, okay? Just tries to change the war, to have a political role in doing that, okay? We've been observing in this last period of time in the political conversation quite a sustained effort in order to persuade every individual to leave the stage and actually look for the paradise within himself. And this comes from a very large number of quite interested, apparently not related conditions, but I would like to show them to you. For example, virtual reality. One thing that is happening quite a bit is within the California ideology and so on and so forth to talk about virtual reality as a way to construct a reality that better fits yourself, making you experience the life, for example, of a very, very rich person. Okay, so you are in the process of gamification of society, of construction of virtual reality. There is a quite sustained effort to say to people, okay, you leave the real stage and you construct your own world that works better for you somewhere else. Okay, that's one point that is emerging quite a lot. Second question is a return of the psychedelic business. Drugs such as LSD or mushrooms that were, Fede, you're back? Federico, are you back with us?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so let me finish just one thing and I give it to you. So that's another piece that we are looking. So mushrooms and LSD used as ways to construct your own internal experience. Okay, this is very much part of the culture that generated the Silicon Valley ideas and ideology. So in a way, also the sort of legalization of all the very, very powerful hallucinogen skunk drugs and marijuana and so on and so forth that is happening in California and elsewhere also goes in the direction of saying, okay, get stoned, be happy, don't do politics. Okay, kind of thing. And this also is in a way part of constructing critique as conspiracy theory, which is happening very, very much right in these days. Okay, where the conspiracy theorist is someone that actually is politically active and draws connections. Okay, maybe he draws too quick connections. Okay, for example, the conspiracy theorist would be some guy who says, okay, the OMS, the World Health Organization, declared the pandemic. Bill Gates is the main funder of the World Health Organization. Bill Gates is in the business of computer. Therefore, if people move to the internet, he's going to gain out of the internet. And also Bill Gates has a very important agenda of vaccinating Africa. And sometimes he said that we are too many in the world. And therefore you make all these kind of connections that are very quick. And in a way, they are not positively proved in any way, okay? So these guys would be deemed a conspiracy theorist. Everybody who is actually suspecting or asking deep questions about the state of affair is always at risk of being considered a conspiracy theorist. But if you think about it, this is exactly the way in which artificial intelligence works. Artificial intelligence with the big data connects with no particular causal relationship, no cause-effect relationship, a variety of very different inputs and very different data that are out there. So for example, you go to a bank, you apply for a loan, you fill up your loan application using capital letters, okay? The machine that would process that in the United States would be less likely to give you the loan if you fill the application in capital letters. So there is an apparently completely unconnected relationship between the fact that you apply by writing in capital letters and the fact or whether you're going to be likely to return the loan or not. But the algorithm, based on millions of previous experiences, shows and knows in a way that there is some connection in the likelihood that someone who applies in that particular way would not pay back the loan, and therefore the bank will not grant the loan. Okay, so this so it doesn't really matter whether that works or not. The point is whether the algorithm or the artificial intelligence that works exactly like a conspiracy theorist and that we consider smart. The more it is connecting dots that are remote and far apart, we consider that a process of improvement in the smartness of the machine. We recognize that as something that can be used and deployed in order to make then institutional decisions, okay? Like, you know, for example, giving a job to someone or giving a loan to someone or doing this kind of things. On the other hand, when it comes to political behavior of the citizen, that same activity, connecting dots or strange hypotheses, rather than being seen as a wealth of data to see perspectives in a different way, which is the way things should go, it is labeled conspiracy theory and completely taken aside of the decent conversation. I'm done with that. So see all these kind of connections that happen. Go ahead, Federico.
Okay, so sorry, I got the question about the psychedelic renaissance, and then what other questions were there?
No, there were no questions. I just took it away from where you left it because you were disconnected.
Ah, okay.
So I just extended. I just told them that we've been recording some pressures to leave the stage and getting inside. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And which of course are pressures of, for example, the first time in which yoga is so important in the West, or Buddhism as a religion is so important in the West. So there, we have processes of inversion of the path in which cultures go from east to west rather than west to east for the first time happening sustainably in this particular time of our life, which is, we thought it was also interesting from that first point of
view. Okay. So, well, just, I mean, a couple of words about these, I mean, conspiracy theories or political paranoia kind of thing. So, I mean, essentially, these kind of terms can be seen as sort of anti-political terms, because they are making, I mean, political, say, I mean, topics more and more technical, more and more sort of medical, or I would say pseudo-medical, because again, there is not even a test, there is not, I mean, a pathologist who can I mean, diagnose those, and also just consider that what we call, I mean, paranoia is usually a sort of, you can imagine it, at least in part, as a sort of defensive mechanism. So someone who feels sort of threatened, okay, and has an overreaction, if you will, that person can be considered paranoid, because, for instance, that person is seeing enemies everywhere, or is seeing threats, I mean, anywhere. At the same time, someone who is actually threatened, or who thinks he or she is threatened for political reasons, and who is sort of developing some ideas, I mean, about who these, I mean, political actors who might be, I mean, threatening, right or wrong, for this citizen. So, I mean, a person who is developing this kind of ideas, instead of being seen as someone who is right or wrong, and instead of having a dialogue, I mean, about those ideas or those theories or those views, we are labeling this person. So, and actually, I mean, something that goes in this direction, I believe, in the same direction, is the widespread use of the phobic terms, okay? For instance, I don't know, xenophobic, or more recent ones, like, I mean, progressophobic. So think about, I don't know, for instance, someone nowadays who is against the widespread use of drones, or of, I don't know, the 5G, or of these invasive and pervasive technologies. This person can be characterized as a progressophobic. And that means that essentially we are giving a label. So we are not saying, oh, you are anti-technology, I disagree with you, and then you start the dialogue. You say, oh, you are progressophobic. There is no dialogue to be sort of engaged in. You need to go and, I mean, essentially, I mean, take it easy, or I mean, relax, or maybe seek, I mean, professional help, in order to, because there is nothing you can actually do to modify the outside world. So there is no political action that you can take. The only kind of environment that you can hope to modify is yourself. So if there is a friction between the outside world with all of these, I mean, technology, invasive, pervasive, more and more omnipresent, you are not, I mean, a legitimate sort of political actor who can say, look, I disagree with this, I want to change how things are. You can only be either, you can either accept it or not. So as Hugo said, in the digital kind of framework, take it or leave it. If you leave it, and if you still have these sort of fears, instead of being open to all of this innovation, well, you need to be considered more like a patient, more like someone who needs to seek help. And actually, it's really interesting. And now I would discuss a little bit the psychedelic renaissance, because the guru of the psychedelic movement during the 60s, and he was, I mean, a psychologist from Harvard. His name was Timothy Leary. He has written a lot. I would invite you to go and read some of his books. They are quite interesting and more relevant nowadays. And he founded, I mean, an association that was called, if I'm not mistaken, the International Federation for Internal Freedom. So it's really interesting how he was stressing the importance of internal freedom, meaning, and he was very explicit. There are even some videos showing that. He was saying, I mean, forget about politics. Politics is horrible. You don't need to be interested in politics. There is a fantastic world inside yourself, and you need to seek internal freedom. Don't deal with politics. So this is one of the ways to read this I mean, ongoing psychedelic renaissance, so-called. So, I mean, the substance is called, I mean, psychedelics, or called hallucinogens. Some examples are some natural ones like mescaline, or artificial ones synthesized like LSD, for instance.
And Federico, another
yeah.
2 minutes to go, so that we open to the questions as well.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So these substances are becoming more and more publicized. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Now, so-called microdosing in the Silicon Valley with LSD, and even in Hollywood, is more and more popular. So one of the actors who won the Oscar this year, I believe it was Brad Pitt, he actually said that he is microdosing at the moment. So so these substances their use is encouraged for healthy people, and now it's more and more encouraged for psychiatric conditions. So, I mean, the first similar substance, that is ketamine, ever approved for a psychiatric condition was approved by the Food and Drug Administration under the Trump administration in March of 2019, and that is ketamine for depression. So, and recently Trump actually said that the Veterans Administration needs to buy a lot of this new drug because it's going to benefit veterans quite a lot. So we are seeing a sort of I mean, resurgence in the use of these hallucinogenic or psychedelic substances for medical and non-medical uses as well. And we can see it in the context of this increased internal freedom and increased depoliticization of the public discourse.
Okay, thank you to both our speakers, and the floor is open to questions and opinions. Who wants to go first?
Mariellina, unmute yourself.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Okay.
Yes, Mariella,
sorry.
go.
Sorry.
Oh, it's the same. It's the same.
Same name.
Yeah. Same name. Fantastic. This. So, Mariella Pittari and Mariella Pandolfi, MP, fantastic. So, of course, there are a lot of intriguing issues, but first of all, I want to come back really more historically. So you know that in Italy, we have a sort of really feeling about politics and psychiatric context, no? Because we invented in one way the idea that psychiatric illness was an illness of a society, as you know, and you nominate Jervis, but you can remember Basaglia, you can Foucault in France. So this idea of to put together political issue and psychiatric context in terms of diagnosis or in terms of personal feeling is quite intriguing. So why I remember this historical context? Because the interesting issue that Ugo and Frederick developed, they are not a sort of cultural context. So I know that we are in the digital universal context, but I think that is also very important to come back, maybe because I am an anthropologist, to also the cultural difference. Are you use, or are you are victims, or are you are inside this kind of new processes? So this was for me an intriguing idea that you developed, that is universal. Of course, you know that the jurists are they denied these cultural differences, but they are also important in terms of resistance or in terms of to develop the other street. They are not main street. So this is it for me. So did you in your book and in your issue look at also this possibility of the cultural differences in terms of the reaction, in terms of, so in both terms?
Okay, let me, okay, it's, thank you so much. I mean, it's very important. Actually, we started the whole proposal. We are making some sort of a brutal claim, okay? And the brutal claim is universal in the sense that what we are seeing here is, for the first time, an amount of influence of the smart experience, let me call it that way, what we do on the internet for many, many hours a day, wherever we are located and whoever we are, whether we are in the US, whether we are in Europe, whether we are in Africa, whether we are in China. The amount of time we spend over the mean, okay, that's the claim, is determining an amount of commonality in the way we perceive reality that is, we claim, is stronger than the amount of class difference and of cultural difference. Okay, so we are kind of looking at this sort of overall common area. The frontier is common, okay? We all access the same frontier. We are all natives, or in a way, we all live in that frontier. And so the phenomenon we register is a phenomenon that happens at the frontier. And the return from the frontier home, which is exactly what I think you're pointing at, is just occurring. Seems to me that there is, and in fact, it's good that you're talking about resistance here, there is what is gonna happen in terms of the sort of experience we all went through, which is the experience with, I call it the take it or leave it experience, or the law of the stronger. You know, once we are at the frontier of the internet, we depend on the machine with which we are in symbiosis in a way. Okay, we are a different kind of self. We are a cyborgish self in a way that experience that kind of life out there. And just now, it is rapidly coming back, determining the conditions in the real world, and it comes back in the form of a sick person, okay, in the form of the sick individual. And you know, some of the stuff you wrote about your own experience coming back from Canada was very inspirational to me, right? All of a sudden you become some sort of an entity which is sick, needs to be protected as long as it assumes that it accepts to be a person in need and puts herself or himself in the hands of the power. The moment in which you don't accept to be a patient and you try to rebel from becoming a patient, you get pathologized on the intellectual way, okay? The crazy guy, the paranoid, the conspiracy theorist. So all of that is a way to keep you into those sort of internal part of yourself, which is in a sense something that we noticed also as an attitude. You know, as if you're a celebrity and you say that you've been a cocaine addicted or you were kind of doing all sorts of really bad things, and you're willing to go out there and confess yourself, and you're putting yourself in the sort of the position of saying, okay, I did something really wrong, everybody is able to kind of display clemency, you know, saying, okay, good guy, you know, you suffered and now you are talking. But that implies that you are out of the political arena. Okay, you are accepting in a way a role that is not going to be a political role. The moment in which the political actor introduces some sort of acceptance of being a patient, okay, and then there would be, you know, the people that say, oh, he's a drug addict, or he is a pedophiliac, or whatever. You know, there is this constant attack, and even on the political correct term can explain some of that, right? For example, Alan Dershowitz case, it was recent case, it was quite interesting actually in the United States. This guy is a very, very famous lawyer. He was a top shot lawyer, and he was the author of a very important book in the 60s of law and psychoanalysis. Okay, so it's a guy, and so some colleague of him at Yale said the guy is crazy because he's supporting Bush. He's supporting Trump. Okay, so it's kind of, and also in the whole picture as she was there, she said, and in fact he was also Me Too'd. Not only is crazy, but he's always attracted to the young woman and being a little bit kind of, even if he was then completely released from the accusation and so on and so forth. But there is this sort of narrative that the political action is in a way needs to cannot be the action of someone who is weak or a patient. The only ones that cannot be patients are political actors. All the other ones are to be patientized. So yes, I think that there is going to be differences, but I think that this difference might kick back in the moment of coming back to the reality of the world. But out there on the screen, it seems to me that we all behave pretty much in the same way. And there is quite a lot of literature we are going to that, you know, it's a way of unconscious action. Most of the time we click very quick. It's done by design in the technology of the internet to limit our attention as much as possible, to have people that don't pay any attention, and they are constantly interrupted. The attention span is constantly interrupted. If your attention span is constantly interrupted, you cannot think deeply. If you cannot think deeply, you cannot think politically. Okay? And there is a very interesting quote, I think, that Federico showed me by, I think it was by Rousseau, that said that the way in which you have to make a woman be obedient is when she is still a young girl, you have to interrupt her all the time while she's playing. Because if you do that, then she understands that she has no power on her own agenda. And this seems to me an extremely interesting quote. And it seems to me pretty much what the internet we all experience. You know, we are not masters of our agenda. We are there trying to focus on something, but we are constantly interrupted by a variety of very attractive signs that seduce us in being consumers rather than political actors. And this is the kind of phenomenon we are interested in looking, and how that is basically a controlling process that is probably stronger than the law and even more effective than the law in maintaining social control. That's the idea.
Just the thinking about our topics, there are two interesting books that maybe one is an article, another is a book. So I think that we have to come back to the De Martino, La fine del mondo. Did you remember this unfinished book, the last one that De Martino was writing before that he died? And it's quite intriguing because he looks absolutely politically and the idea of la fine del mondo, because we have to also to connect in now that your topics is inside outside the pandemic moment, no?
Yes.
Came people so, but also the specificity of a pandemic moment is also intriguing with your idea. So La fine del mondo, I think that will be intriguing to come at. So I want real. The second one was Paul Rabinoff, when Foucault arrived in California, he wrote a very intriguing article that was masked, I Go Forward, and it was about the modern subject.
Say it again, the title, please.
So defined as a masked.
Okay.
Masked, I Go Forward. And there was a Paul Rabinoff, was a chapter, I have to remember well, but I can send you the right but was this idea of to be a modern subject means to be masked. So this, and he wrote this in the 82, if I remember well. It was a very wonderful article. So maybe I can send you the reference.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, just this.
Okay. Two questions are waiting. One from Mariella Pittari, and then there will be Jean-Marc Louvain. Mariella, go.
Thank you so much, Professor Mattei and Dr. Federico. There is a book, especially I'm addressing my question for Dr. Federico, about memoirs of my nervous illness from the beginning of the 20th century by a jurist who was a judge from the Supreme Court of Saxonia. And I think this fits perfect to our topic because we are talking about a jurist that goes paranoid with positivism in his whole in the juridical field. So my question is, let's say, is the virtual space the space of freedom of paranoia? Because whoever you are, whatever you think, you can be a conspiracy theorist, you can have the most fascist, terrible thoughts going on in your mind. You have a place for not a political debate, because political debates imply that you are participating in consensus, you are producing some sort of interaction to build some structures. In the virtual space, whereas in the virtual space, you can produce whatever you want, you can say whatever paranoid things goes on in your mind, and the data collection is measure you, and it doesn't matter what content you are putting out there. And this is sort of how our brain works, because it's important that we try to build something else in society, that it's not how our mind works. But I think that the virtual space is so important because it's where paranoia just gets total freedom to express itself. And it's the reason why law has been replaced by this kind of interaction, and politics has been replaced by this kind of interaction. So I don't know if you have some insight on these books, because it goes on my mind that it's so important for a society of control that Deleuze talks about. Thank you.
Federico?
Yeah, okay, thank you for this question. So there are a lot of things in it, and thank you for reminding of that book. Actually, I believe it was one of the very few cases of amipsychosis that Freud ever wrote about, because usually Freud wrote about what usually we call neurosis. And thinking about the fact that Freud actually discussed that case, let me go back for a moment to the structure that Freud thought toward the last part of his life that the mind has, that is composed of three elements. We were actually discussing this with Ugo yesterday. One is the ego, okay? There is the conscious part that essentially interact with the external world, and then below it, largely unconscious, there is the id, that essentially is the element that we associate with passions or with impulses or even with dreams. So when the ego goes to sleep and reason goes to sleep at night, for instance, that's when the id is coming out. Sometimes in a disguised manner, but we make all of these sort of associations in our dreams. And actually, the psychedelic experience is quite similar, because it causes what the psychedelic people say, a sort of ego dissolution or ego death. And then the id, expresses itself. Now, and then there is another component that is derived from the id. There is a super ego. There is this sort of internalized father figure that is sort of low, but is punishing. Essentially, it's surveying and punishing. This reminds us of Foucault as well. And now this superego nowadays is becoming sort of technologized. Is becoming replaced by technology, by this surveillance and possibly punishment system. So we are encouraged to sort of express ourselves, for instance, online, but not in the real world, because as soon as we try to be political, and we can see this nowadays during the pandemic, if we try to say, look, I don't agree with what is going on, we need to act politically and to discuss democratically. Say, no. That's not for you to decide. We have some scientists that we have selected, who knows how, and they are telling us what to do in the outside world, in the political world, but in the virtual world. And actually it's very interesting, because Timothy Leary, the guru of the psychedelic world, also told us that in his late years, he became a sort of digital guru. And essentially he said that there is no solution of continuity between LSD and the digital. Now, this might sound like a little bit like a strange statement, but there are a lot of connections that unfortunately we don't have time to discuss. And there is a sort of subculture that is called cyber psychedelic culture, okay? So as you can see, some of these themes go together. You can express yourself and say even the most horrible kind of things online or in your internal virtual world, or you can free your id as if you were in a sort of dreamlike state, maybe even with the help of psychedelic or hallucinogenic substances. And you can get in this sort of cyber psychedelic mood as long as your ego is out of the place, which means your reason and your autonomy, and to some extent your dignity and your freedom, as long as you don't want to say anything at all political, which means about the external world, as long as you don't claim anymore that you have rights that are protected by the law and by the supreme law, which is the Constitution. So you can express yourself, you can say the most horrible things, and that's actually even better to some extent, because there is going to be, a record of all of that. So you can express your id in a sort of irrational way, because, and until a few months ago, someone could have said, well, look, if you invite people to use mass psychedelics And actually, some people have actually done that, not just Trump with ketamine, but also one of the founders of the so-called Extinction Rebellion movement recently said, we need to use psychedelics, massively, and people didn't understand why. So, because nowadays we have technology to regulate ourselves, so we can express ourselves freely, even in a sort of mad way or dreamlike way, because technology is going to take care of our internalized father figure, of our internalized law. Technology is going to be our super ego, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and if I can add just a word, Mariella, it's very important what Federico added, that it is true that is a place in which you can say horrible things, but exactly in this time, in this emergency time, the level of censorship on the internet had increased massively, and every kind of theory that challenges the scientific truth, that which is to say the combination of the dominant scientific vision and its technological transmission to society, all of that kind of language, and even the challenge of the idea of methodological, so to say, doubt, is under censorship. Lots of videos are taken away from YouTube, and a lot of sites of so-called alternative information are actually challenged by Google, by Facebook, that have introduced both in the algorithms and in their policies the exclusion of certain kind of political talk. So it is true when it is not, it is in a way personal psychedelic internal, but it's not true at all when it comes to the biopolitical sphere that is the one we're experiencing now.
Thank you. After Jean-Marc, who's going to take the floor now, there will be Cristina. Go, Jean-Marc.
Thank you so much, Pepe. Thank you so much, Professor Mattei. Thank you so much, Professor Soldani. I have a question concerning the patientization phenomenon. And more specifically, I was wondering whether this phenomenon is like a group phenomenon, which means that everybody is becoming a patient. So we were first citizen, then we have been transformed into consumers, and now we're becoming patients. Or if this phenomenon is more like a device that the capitalist system uses to sort out and exclude some citizen or patient actually that works against us or criticize not us, the capitalist system.
Well, the theory of that we are trying to work out in the book is certainly very universal. We claim that is something that is happening to everybody. It's the next step from the consumer. The idea is, the consumer stopped exercising political critique, and consumer sovereignty has been completely rooted towards the sovereignty of economic choice. Okay, this is consumer sovereignty. So the person, the citizen, becomes a sovereign in his economic choices. So in buying, basically, and politics is becoming more and more, especially representative politics, is becoming more and more commodified itself, a commodity we choose from. Then we witnessed the transformation of, due to big data, the transformation of the consumer into himself a commodity. And this is Shoshana Zuboff's argument of surveillance capitalism, right? In other words, in the world of the free, of the free access to the internet, you become a surveillance technology. So you are basically selling yourself, and you are not the subject anymore, but you are an objectified commodity of a product of prediction. That would be the idea that developed in that line, Zuboff, but others also, Lanier. Now we are studying the return from the frontier. And in the return from the frontier, so from being an object in the sense of being a data, an aggregate of data when we live on the frontier, now we return home. We return in the real world, and what is left of us in the real world, we are patients. Okay, so the transformation becomes, in a way, a transformation that we claim has a pervasive value of a controlling process that is clearly functional, you know, to the way in which capitalism has to deal with the present, current, catastrophic consequence that is going to happen. You know, capital goes from crisis to crisis. Right now, there is a crisis of overproduction. There is an ecological crisis, all these sorts of things. And the way to handle this is to have a populace that is passionate, that is made into patients, because there are very serious risks of political turmoil, political challenge, and even, you know, violence going on. And this is a good way to keep everybody in his or her place.
Okay, now Christina and then Caitlin. Christina, go.
All right, thank you, Professor Mattei and Dr. Federico, and just Pepe for organizing this webinar. So I'm wondering about the fact that you mentioned that the stage is the political arena, and that the mosque is the politically active citizen. And I'm just wondering about this shift that we've seen, that the more people who become members of this internet community and internet users, that we're seeing this shift from being a citizen to being a netizen. So this concept has been floating around for the past couple of years, that netizens are members of an internet community. And I think even Professor Zhang can maybe speak on this with regards to the fact that in China, for example, netizens are known to be ethically responsible and they critique against the government. And so it's sort of, you know, a platform in which citizens who do not have the possibility to exercise political freedom in reality can become netizens, and then exercise that, you know, can be uncensored and say what they want on a in a virtual space as a netizen through pseudonyms or whatever it might be. And so I'm just wondering, how do we then conceptualize this this analogy of stage and mosque when it comes between the difference between being a citizen and a netizen? And at the same time, is it possible in some ways to use the netizen space as a way of channeling new ways of talking about politics and creating a new political arena? So I'm just wondering about sort of citizen, netizen, and how do we then sort of, you know, use this netizen space as a way in which political freedom can still be exercised?
I don't know. I wonder where you know, I'm not familiar with the literature, so I can just I would be very thankful if you can give me some reference. It sounds horribly neoliberal to me, and very Western centric and self-serving. You know, oh, in China they don't have the political freedom, therefore they go on the net where everybody's free. It already turns me down a little bit as a general geopolitical concept, I must say, because whenever there is this sort of self-serving idea that the citizen is out there alive and well at the global space, and look what the case is, he looks like the liberal American. Okay, when things are like that, it seems to me that they are suspicious at least. But I would be glad to read a little more. Of course, you're asking a bigger question, which is the usual one. How can we, or is there any space of deploying technological transformations or transformations in the advances in the establishment of capitalism in a way that is counter-hegemonic? But it seems to me that we are in some way already now constructing a society which is very globalist. And there is a process of, with this process, but this is like, it's not, I don't think it's going to be part of the book, but it's part of thoughts around it. Seems to me that what's happening now is pretty similar to what used to happen, you know, in the 17th century, where there was a need at least of the sovereign state. And then a later phase, we had the need at least of the, you know, super sovereign entities like, you know, European Union, bigger ones. Now it seems to me that there is a quite sustained process of trying to construct a global government. And that is, it seems to me, is the big stake of the next few years. You know, there is going to be quite a violent amount of clashes. You know, maybe a new 30 years war or something like that, in order to gain full control over the global patients. And this seems to me that is where we should look at, you know, new hegemonies and how the political systems are resembling more and more each other, which is this is fascinating. No matter how we can keep using this old rhetoric of saying, oh, you know, China over there, they don't have law, they don't have this, they don't have rights, they don't have political freedom, all that bullshit. We are just merging towards a direction in which no individual citizen has any sort of political agency. And what we're merging to is the construction of larger collective persons that might look like Google or might look like the Communist Party of China. And the question is going to be who of the two is more legitimate in terms of having control over the data of all the patients. Seems to me, you know, there are these large entities with tremendous control, tremendous political might, tremendous economic possibilities, and tremendous technology that deal with each other in controlling, you know, the construction of the internet and the big geopolitical platform of the present. And it seems to me that staying over there, kind of discussing, you know, in all the liberal democratic categories, what is going on is just a waste of time. I think we have to try to understand things in their real global and phenomenology, which is, you know, large and organized entities with little individuals and control. And the issue of legitimacy is wide open.
Okay, there are another two questions. Then you speakers, you'll tell me when you are tired enough. So the first question is from Caitlin and then Bereket. Caitlin, go.
Hi, thank you to both professors for this webinar and to Pepe for facilitating. I just have maybe not a question, but just something maybe to comment on. So I'm interested in the assertion that we as citizens are losing our political agency through not being empowered to question politics or political moves by authorities, except on the internet, as you explored. But I wanted to maybe challenge that assertion by perhaps posing that instead of it being removed from us, it's rather been filtered into a way that can be more effective, in that we're provided with structures to voice our political agencies. Because as you can imagine, if everybody just took to the streets to try and voice their own political views, it wouldn't really result in much change for the positive or for the negative, or much change at all. And I want to know, how does this assertion of yours fit into the presence of the right to public involvement in policymaking, which I would say is one of these structures by which we can vocalize our political agency, as well as civil society movements who have seen, I know in my own country in South Africa, who have seen a lot of success in making their political voices and those that are, and the political voices of those that are perhaps silenced, more heard.
Thank you for the question. It's very good. I mean, it's this book is concerned with an analysis of the current situation and the current hegemonies, okay? And we don't have any desire whatsoever to downplay the possible power of resistance and of reconstruction, and indeed the construction of new institutional structures that can develop in a collective way to reorganize the political spaces and the political agenda. There is nothing that should be read in these pages, and if you read the proposal, that appears pretty clearly. What we are trying to do here is to show how the traditional idea of law, okay, as a way to deal with the organization of the stage that for the last couple of hundred years has been completely functional to the construction of the capitalist project and its global hegemony, okay, is now a recessive form of dominant political control, and the sort of call it collective hypnosis or collective depolitization or whatever, so the collective distractedness, whatever you want to call it, the moving of the economy on the frontier of the internet and of the people with the economy in the frontier of the internet trained us to behave as accepting a certain relationship of power. I think that everybody of us here hates Zuckerberg's Facebook and has horrible things to do about a lot of the things, but we still use it. Okay, we still use it. We have a lot of horrible things to say about, and we know all the risks of using WhatsApp or whatever in terms of surveillance, but we still use it. Okay, and is that a choice or not? Maybe it's a choice, maybe it's not. But the fact is, the truth is that we are attracted in an almost irresistible way to follow certain kind of hegemonies. Okay, and the way in which then we can produce, create, and develop counter-hegemonies or even revolutionary forces in this scenario is an open question. I think it connects very well to the question that Mariella Pandolfi has made at the beginning. It's probably something that is going to be highly local and physical, and the sort of pleasure through which we are separated physically in these last phases, and how the power insists on that and uses, you know, quasi-terrorist attitudes in saying to the people, you know, this guy can be effective on you, and this sort of extremely sustained effort to separate our bodies is because the resistance comes from the bodies. Okay. The construction is in the mind, the resistance is in the bodies. This I think is one of the things that should be taken into consideration. But we didn't want it at all to say, okay, we are screwed, there is no space for counter-organization or anything like that. We're just trying to focus on the traditional structures of the extractive power of capitalism and how they are being changed and what are the consequences of this transformation. This is what we are dealing with. And, you know, the constructing of the commons institutions is still my passion.
Okay, a question by Bereket. If there are any other questions, please raise your hand or let me know through the chat. Bereket.
Do you mind if I mentioned before this last question, just, I mean, a couple of things that are relevant for the last three questions, I think, yeah? I mean, can I?
Please do.
I believe three questions. Let me go. One was how are citizens being transformed massively into patients, and another one, the second to last one was about so-called, I mean, netizens, and then the last one was, well, I mean, there are spaces and political spaces on the internet. Now, I would just make a couple of considerations that might be relevant to this, because the more we are online and the more our lives are digitalized, we are seeing a sort of interesting phenomenon. Just consider for a moment this, and this also relates to how psychiatry is relevant to all of these things, which is not kind of obvious at first glance, but when you understand the logic, it might become quite obvious. And the logic is the following. I mean, until a few months ago, nobody would have said for the past 200 years or so that you can make a psychiatric diagnosis without a psychiatric interview, which means you cannot diagnose a mental health condition if you don't interact directly with the patient. And the more open the patient is, the better. The more the patient sort of confesses, in a sense, and opens up and is not guarded, which is considered to be a very negative thing in order to make a diagnosis in psychiatry, the better it is. But think about what people have been saying about Trump. Now, I'm just taking that as a sort of spectacle, because we look at the spectacle and we learn all of the diagnosis. So people are learning now the language of diagnosis, and people are learning the fact that you can maybe diagnose someone even if you don't interview that person, just based on existing facts. Now, this is a very dangerous concept, because facts can easily transform into data. And now consider that there are data about all of us, like a ton of data. And people are increasingly saying, look, I mean, we can make digital diagnosis. We can tell, well, when people have these characteristics, we can label them this way or that way, and we can even make predictions. So this is where we are all becoming patient, because now all of these predictions and all of these labels, they need to be acted upon. And also, I would add something else, that while the citizen is meant to be to some extent sort of active, patient, which comes from Latin, and it means, actually nowadays people sometimes refer even to clients when we talk about demedicalized health professions. But when we talk about patients properly, it comes from Latin patior, which implies to suffer, to endure, to experience, to wait, to allow, to acquiesce, and to submit. Very passive. And if you consider, so I'm a little bit skeptical personally about the possibility of being free if we get into a system in which a lot of information about us are shared, because our brains have a limited computational power, if you will, while, I don't know, I mean, big computers or artificial intelligence, virtually, they have no limit to their computational power. So if we allow these systems to make prediction about ourselves, our freedom, in my view, is restricting over and over. So this is how we tend to become patients, because there are all of this data, and these people are saying, look, in order to have an efficient society, now we need to use this data to make predictions, to provide labels, and to cure people. They are going to use a sort of benevolent sort of rhetoric and say, look, we don't want to hurt you, of course. If you think that we want to hurt you, you are paranoid. If you think that there is a threat, you are kind of progressophobic, you are technophobic. You need to open up, just like in psychiatry. We have all of this data, we will label you, we will cure you. And you're going to be more and more passive, also because we will be able to make predictions about things that you don't even know about. So I hope that this puts together a little bit of the of these issues. Yeah.
Thank you. So before our last question by Bereket, I would love to take this opportunity to thank Federico Morena, a student from this class who's been precious in helping me with all the technicalities of these connections. Also, I would like to remind you of next pandemic lecture by P.G. Monateri, Leviathan Inverted, a reading from the pandemic. This will be next Monday, the 11th of May at 1500, so an hour later. Okay, Bereket, go.
Okay, thank you for the interesting presentation. My questions are basically two. So the first question is, I know you've been mentioning about the Chinese experience if as the better option to the problem that we are having. So can you please explain or expand a bit on how it has been chosen as a better, maybe a way out to the problem? And also the second question is that what would be, how can the law regain its previous position? So I think from the presentation and also from the summary of your book or the proposal, that I can understand that the role of law is supplanted somehow by this ICT related phenomenon. So how can the law regain its position as a dominant force of social control? These are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, About China, we didn't enter into some sort of evaluation whether it's better or whether it's worse. We've been observing that in the handling of the COVID-19 crisis, the kind of way in which the state of exception has been handled over there in China deployed a variety of strategies and techniques that just in just a few months before, no one in the West would even have thought that would be possible to implement. Okay, would have been considered the ultimate tyrannic, the ultimate, so to say, dictatorial intervention in the fundamental freedoms of the human beings, that only people that are part of the sort of a model of governance like the Eastern tyranny could actually deploy. That would have been the narrative just a little time before. After this handling of this crisis, every single country in the Western tradition has been trying basically to do what China has done in terms of, but it was much less effective in doing it because the way of centralizing the pyramid of control failed. Okay, so basically what happened in China was that the rule of emergency law, as our friend Liu would call it, deployed a complete centralization of power, a chain of decision making that was based and rooted into the party, the changing of officers to a certain purposes. The whole thing worked out in a very hierarchical working way. And it deployed surveillance technology to a large extent in order to predict social behavior, to limit the possibility of people to move and so on and so forth, okay? Now that kind of model had been tried elsewhere, but has been impaired by a variety of inconsistencies. Nothing had to do with a rejection on some sort of higher intellectual or principle standard, okay? Our own government in Italy went against the whole tradition of the rule of law with no repentment, okay? The system of sources of law has been completely screwed up. There was no sense that we had to respect some sort of fundamental organizational freedoms. It's just they didn't work in the same way. They tried, but then they got into all sorts of local inconsistencies that didn't work. Similarly in the United States, I don't think that Trump had any sort of principled resistance to the idea of surveilling the people. They did it all the time, or to, you know, centralize the power and go against the formal rule of law. They did it, but, you know, the system kind of proved clumsy in doing it, because there were all sorts of structural conditions, such as, you know, the privatized nature of the health services, which is a big issue everywhere, or other things like that, you know, private organized interests that work in the way to succeed doing that. But this is what we observed, okay? And the attempt to use technology, even very invasive technology, to control people and to know about people and to actually put this technology on a basically compulsory way, was also something that started happening, you know, first in China, then in Korea, then in Israel, and then all the way to Italy and elsewhere. So it has been growing and penetrating into tradition that would value a lot, for example, privacy or things like that, okay? So all of that we observed. So that means that, you know, the result of that was that in China, apparently the issue has been solved with no more people that are sick right now. And so this became a huge international, a huge international propaganda, if you want to call it, for the Chinese model that proved out to be quite efficient and working in a particular way, to the point of possibly changing the hegemony in law, because the law is going out, technology is going up. In that kind of changed relationship we study in the book, we might be seeing some new processes of hegemonic transformation. This is what we said about that. As far as how the law can regain a role, I think that the law is bound, everything, not the law, not just the law, but also the political process is bound to die and to disappear if it tries to mimic technology. Okay? The law has been trying to mimic technology in the United States beginning, you know, at least in the 60s with the law and economics movement. The law has been trying to mimic technology through formal bureaucracy in Europe since a long time. Okay? If the law tries to mimic technology, it is to say it doesn't recognize the intimate, human, political, qualitative nature, cultural nature of the law itself, and it tries to mimic technology, is gonna be substituted by technology, because technology is better than law in governing society as a machine. So the law can regain its position if it refuses to function as a machine and it starts back to function as a set of cultures. That would be my position.
Thank you.
Okay, bear with me. A very last question by Gelaila. Gelaila, are you with us?
Here. Thank you so much for a very interesting lecture. I am a cognitive theory junkie, so it was very interesting to me. I have two questions, but I'm gonna just ask one because of time. So we talked a bit about how power continues to shape our behavior, particularly towards us being our own villains, i.e. the usage of social media platforms, particularly Facebook. And I was wondering, in relation to the current narrative of customer empathy that has been perpetuating more and increasing users for Facebook, even when there's such huge allegations of privacy issues and whatnot, do you think power still explains the construction of empathy? And if so, how? Thank you.
I let the answer to the last word to Federico.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Because maybe I thought this was more a question for Ugo, but so what sort of aspect of the transformation to patients or of the psychiatrization of the legal or political discourse do you think is, at play here?
I'm no expert, but empathy could be either forced or it could be nicely suggested. I would say, yeah.
Okay, so is your question about what might be the role of empathy in
no, how would one envision the construction of empathy in the perpetration of the user-consumer identity? Is it necessarily being forcefully imposed on us, or is it being, constructed parallel to power?
Okay. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer exactly what you're asking. Please, let me know. But it can't. But something is coming to mind, because the concept of empathy is also related to what we call sometimes in cognitive sciences, a theory of mind, which means that, for instance, when we see someone, or even when we, let's say when we see someone, like another person, we don't see just a moving object, but we can sort of intuitively, some people are better at this, sometimes and some other people are not as good, but people can learn this, people can get better at this. We recognize that this person is not just a moving object who is responding to some stimuli, but has a subjectivity. So we can put ourselves in this person's shoes. Yeah. So, and sometimes other psychotherapists, especially here in England, they call this process mentalization, meaning I use my imagination, if you will, to think that another person has a mind of his or her own. Okay. So, of course, we only have access to our own mind, sort of direct access. The access to other people's minds is sort of indirect. Now, it's really interesting because, especially nowadays, that all of our relations are more and more, and we see this with the pandemic quite a lot, sort of mediated through digital technology. Now, our reactions, and there are people studying this, are very different if we think that there is another person on the other side of the screen, or if we think that we're interacting with a machine. Let me give you this example, if I may. There is a sort of a game in game theory that is called the ultimatum game. So if we have, for instance, $20, okay, I can decide how to split them, but then say you will decide whether we are going to get each his or her part. Okay, so let's say that we have $20. I decide to split them 50-50, so $10 and $10. If you don't accept this deal, I take 0, you take 0. If you accept this deal, I take 10 and you take 10 in this case. Okay, so let's say that I split the $20 or 20 pounds or euros or whatever, or bitcoins, in 10 and 10. Would you accept this kind of deal?
No, I would probably cheat. I think game theory deems it that I would cheat.
Okay, but let's say that I am the one who decides how to split, and you decide whether we take anything or not. I say that it's 10 and 10. Do you accept the deal?
Sure. 10 is better than nothing. 10, yeah.
And I take 10. Okay, next deal. I decide to split it in 15 and 5. Do you accept the deal?
Do I know who's taking the 5?
You are taking the 5 and I'm taking the 15. But if you say no, you are going to take 0. If you say yes, you are going to take 5. Do you accept the deal?
I would.
Okay. Let's split into 19 and 1. If you accept, you take 1. If you don't accept, you take 0. But if you accept and take 1, I take 19. Do you accept the deal?
No, I wouldn't. 1 is just too low for me to.
Okay, perfect. Because so you decide to take 0 instead of 1, because in a sense you have, let's call it a sense of justice. Okay, you are interacting with another mind, with another person, and you have a sense also of distributive justice, if you will. Now, try to imagine that there is not another person on the other side, but that I am just a sort of hologram. So I'm just a machine, pretending to be a person. And I offer you, 19 and 1. Do you accept the deal?
I can't negotiate with you, so maybe I would. Maybe.
Right. Because, interestingly enough, when we don't think that there is another person on the other side of the machine, but a sort of mechanical entity, 1 is better than 0. So there is no sense of distributive justice. So this is just an idea to suggest that when we believe that it is machines that are regulating our sort of world, we tend to accept lower sort of deals. We tend to accept less because we don't have this sense that the machine is actually gaining anything. But if we know there is another person, well, we have a very different approach. So this might have a lot of consequences, even politically, because if we are going to believe that some of the processes that are decided on this increasingly digitalized world are decided by machines, we might accept some deals. But if we believe there is someone behind the machines, and maybe if I believe it, someone is going to tell me that I am politically paranoid or I'm a conspiracy theorist. There is no one on the other side of the machine. It's just a machine. So you need to accept the lower deal. And actually it's very interesting because there are some people nowadays that are studying how our reaction to the ultimatum game changes if we are under the effect of psychedelic substances at the same time. Substances like ecstasy or like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, which is actually going to be, which is currently going to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration for some psychiatric conditions, by the way. So it's really interesting how nowadays these, people who study these processes, they are studying how our decisions change if we believe we are playing with a machine or with another human, and whether our reactions to this kind of interaction change, whether we are under the effect of psychedelic substances or whether we are not. So I hope these answers to some extent.
Oh, it answers perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you to our two speakers, Federico and Ugo. Let me thank you also Mariella Pandolfi, who has been with us and will be with us for one of our next pandemic lectures. I'll see you, I hope, all next Monday for PG Monateri's Leviathan Inverted. Ciao, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.